Welcome to another episode of the DNA of Things. I'm pleased to introduce Edgar McBean on this week's episode. Edgar is a leading figure in the genomics industry, known for his impactful work with Pathway Genomics, one of the very first direct-to-consumer genomics companies focused specifically on pharmacogenomics and the polyrisk scores associated with susceptibility to different medications. Edgar's also worked with Illumina, the world's largest supplier of the hardware associated with genome sequencing, and Helix. Helix, who is on the forefront of conducting some of the world's most significant population genomics research initiatives. So Edgar brings a breadth of knowledge with us today, and in our conversation, we explore his unique journey into genomics, starting with his unconventional path from military service to becoming a key player in the consumer genomics industry. We explore the challenges and triumphs of bringing DNA insights to consumers and healthcare systems alike. Edgar shares pivotal moments from his career, highlighting the evolution of genomics from research to actionable health interventions. By listening, you'll gain insights into the future of personalized healthcare, the ethical considerations of DNA data, and how genomics can empower you to take charge of your health. This episode promises to offer valuable knowledge that could change how you view your own health and well-being, starting with your DNA from the inside out. It's my pleasure to welcome Ed McBean, a leader in genomics with a rich background, educated at Duke University in public policy analysis and holding a master's from Rush University in health systems management, and has significantly contributed to the field of genomics. His career journey, among other initiatives, took him from Pathway Genomics, where he led product development work in some of the early days consumer genomics products, to Illumina, a global force in terms of supplying the consumable goods for DNA sequencing. That's both the machines and the reagents. And then with a focus on population genomics and really spearheading some exciting initiatives there at Helix and ultimately enhancing DNA insight accessibility. So Ed's blend of policy management and genomics expertise is the driving force of personalized healthcare. So with that as a background, I wanted to dive in on the beginning stages, like really the man behind the mission first. Like obviously your CV is incredible. Your reputation precedes you. You know, we've done a little bit of preliminary business development type work in the past, but I've known about you since the early days of Helix, going 8 years back. I'm interested to know about your journey into genomics and personalized healthcare. So how does, Edgar, the young man, the boy, enter into the genomics field? And, what are some of the pivotal moments that steered you towards dedicating your career in this science?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Interesting question. I think I've had a pretty non-traditional path compared to many of my peers who I think many people were fascinated by DNA, at some point in high school or college and went on to get a PhD. And that was really not my route. After graduating from college, I enlisted in the military and spent a few years as an infantry medic. Really good experience, life experience, not so much on the initial path that I projected. And then went on to my early career was all in healthcare technology, product management, helping build out platforms for supply chains, payment transactions, et cetera, trying to drive some innovation of sort of early internet technology into healthcare. And after about a decade of that, I left. I got so frustrated trying to drive change into healthcare when, doctor's office wouldn't allow a browser because they were worried about what their staff might be doing on the internet instead of taking care of patients. And I left healthcare for a little while. And after a few years and a few jobs, I remember very clearly, very distinctly, I was leading a product team at a user-generated video company, uploading user-generated content, and sitting in the meeting as we were trying to figure out how to encode a video, and just looking at myself in the proverbial mirror going, I don't care. Like, this doesn't matter. This is nothing, this isn't making the world a better place. This isn't solving a critical problem. This is just, not even really good business because this is the video we were looking at wasn't going to drive a lot of user traffic. So I really in the middle of that meeting that I needed to get back into healthcare. And I was very fortunate to have a colleague who introduced me to the founder of Pathway Genomics And I was able to join Pathway as employee number 6, building out the product and engineering teams initially, and ultimately managing a lot of the customer success and marketing functions as well. So that was sort of my pathway into genomics. And despite not having had a formal background or training in it, was able to learn on the job as we were building out the company, building out our interpretation capabilities, building out the lab, et cetera, and a really great and collaborative team who were willing to teach me along the way as I learned some of the details around genetics in its early days.
That's interesting. The military background, well, you're in good company in terms of military background and genomics. Actually, I would call him the godfather of consumer genomics, although he wouldn't like it if I said that. But John Ferreira, who's a former VP of Ancestry DNA, was actually well, not military, but a naval officer himself. So there's something to be said for the logistics and the operations and systematization of the complexities that we see in the genomic space. Now, Pathway Genomics, that, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that was out of San Diego. Is that right?
Yeah, they're based in San Diego, and it was really such a fascinating time because it was the early days of consumer genomics, and we were really competing head to head with 23andMe. We'd see, we would put things out on our website, they'd make a change, on the website, we'd make a change. Obviously, they were much more successful than we were, and have gone on to, I think they had a lot of benefits to them as an organization, but we were really very, very competitive with them in terms of product capabilities and functionality. And there was you were asking earlier about pivotal moments. We signed a partnership to sell our collection kits in Walgreens and to have that as a distribution channel to give consumers access. And to us, this was not that big of a deal, but it turned out to create quite a firestorm. We upset a lot of people in the industry because they're like, oh, this is consumer genomics going too far and too fast. And, all the people will access this and so on. Upset us some regulatory considerations of is this legal? Is this okay? And ultimately also led to a congressional investigation. So, but for me, as a result of that, what felt like a small decision at the time was really able to have a front seat at some of these changes in healthcare and be able to certainly go along with our chief science officer and present at a number of conferences where the industry was pretty mad at us because we kind of upset the balance that was in place in terms of laboratory developed tests and sort of the regulatory environment that everybody was working in, and brought controversy and attention to many people who didn't want it, whether or not they were involved in personal genomics or other aspects, but we're trying to avoid some of this scrutiny. We had some very tense closed door meetings with the FDA, kind of, who are you guys and what are you up to? And, how are you doing this in a regulatory compliant way? And ultimately a congressional hearing with the Energy and Commerce Committee, investigating consumer access to their own genomic information. So had a significant role in that. I wrote our congressional testimony, participated in many of those presentations, and really enjoyed a front row seat to driving this kind of change into the healthcare industry, which is something I wouldn't trade for anything.
I think about the people who were, or even may still be adversarial to consumer genomics. What's their point of view? Why shouldn't consumers have access to their DNA?
Yeah, I do think I'm sure it hasn't gone away completely, but it's, I think in general, a sentiment that's been pretty marginalized at this point. But the concerns were that people would have access to information and misuse it, right? And that they would learn they have a risk of a disease and overreact to it and maybe make some ill-informed health choices. They might, self-adjust their medications if they look at the pharmacogenomics. Or they might just not even fully understand the information that's given to them and misinterpret. And some of this can be fairly technical, right? What's relative risk versus absolute risk? Some questions along those lines. And it would cause a lot of sort of either bad choices on behalf of patients or a lot of anxiety on behalf of patients as they try to understand or misunderstand the information or communicate it with other family members. I think in reality, that just hasn't really played out. I'm sure we could find, some cases of people misunderstanding what the reports meant, but we could also find that of, a visit to your doctor. So I don't, but I think by and large those fears haven't played out. And I think one of the crowning achievements I think is if you treat the government as one single monolithic entity, and the government was opposed to this through the congressional hearing and the FDA approach. Now with all of us, they consider it an absolute requirement that every patient who participates get access to their genomic information, and those interpretations are shared back with patients. So I think a big change. Again, you can't treat the government as a single monolithic entity, but that's a big change from where the government was viewing this 8 or 10 years ago to now see it as a standard part of a program like All of Us.
Right. Right. So you mentioned all of us. Like, what is all of us? It's an NIH initiative. Can you share a little bit
Yeah.
on that?
It's an NIH sponsored research program inviting people to participate and share their genomic information, which is generated as part of the initiative, as well as their EHR. And then they run a series of blood tests and others to capture some basic biometric information and put all that into a shared database. So they're looking to enroll a total of 1 million people. And there are other countries that are doing similar programs. This was initially pioneered by the NIH. 100,000 genome program was the first of this nature. But what I think they're really doing a good job, and they just published some data on this, is the work to engage underrepresented communities into these types of programs. Many of these databases can be very heavily weighted toward Western European Caucasian populations. And if we're trying to personalize healthcare, we got to personalize it for everybody, not just for white males. So I think they've done a really good job of addressing and bridging some of those gaps that have caused some of those communities to be hesitant and fearful in participating and sharing their data into programs like this, and to do that outreach and engagement, make them feel comfortable that their information is being handled responsibly and with proper care and used to their ultimate benefit of either themselves individually or their communities.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. So that's potentially the outcome is better representation of the, call it, true measure of human diversity.
Yep.
As indicated by the human genome, right? And so if we just kind of take a step back, when you think about the human genome, 3 billion base pairs, 3 million variable sites, that is, let's say, the source for all the differences that we see in humanity, different heights, different eye colors, different skin pigmentation, essentially any quantifiable genetic trait. Well, of course, that in begs the question, well, how is that genetic trait nurtured? And we know that, there's many genes there where there's this kind of epistatic relationship. And so there's a symphony, there's an orchestration of all these genes. And so an overall symphony, that is you, that is the human. And so now we're talking about deconstructing all of those different symphonies as it relates to human diversity, which, is interesting. And so I should warn you, I have a closet nerd when it comes to folks like Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary biologist. One of his books that he wrote was the mismeasure of man, and he speaks on basically trying to reduce IQ, what human intelligence, down to a single score, that is IQ, and it actually became the basis of all the standardized testings that we've done ever. And as we've learned, it's actually false. It's actually not helpful. It actually doesn't take into account, cultural differences, environmental influence, et cetera. So, it's funny you talk about the better or true representation of human diversity. And so that moves us from, as you say, white male, particularly white male of Western European descent. And then we've enriched the data set now with, effectively what it seems to be is you're going to get a new reference genome, right? That because I think the original was based off like 12 people or something, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then it was as you said, the 100,000 genomes. So that kind of filled in the gaps. And I think that's an important thing for, let's say, the lay listeners, is that, in as much as we have a reference genome, it's not exactly perfect. And you don't exactly have a true accounting for all of human diversity unless you've sequenced all humans. And it seems to me like that's a future we're heading toward, is, every human being sequenced at birth. And sorry, that's just me kind of summarizing what I heard, but, there's a question there. And I think back to the pioneering work that you did in terms of, advocating for individual access to genomics, so that you bring this to your healthcare professional, so that you make more informed choices, et cetera. So these programs now, whether this was always going to be the case, or is this in some way a side effect of that pioneering work that you did, that data, if you do all of us, the 1 million people that are doing it, you get access to your full data, do you not?
I believe so. I don't know exactly what the process is if you want to download your genomic sequence, but I think you at least have the rights to it. And I don't know the process to get it, but yes, you can access that as well as any of the other biometric information that's generated.
Right. So you can not only download your DNA data, but also your full electronic health information, the bloods that they do, et cetera. And so basically people are getting now what it seems to be the beginnings of longitudinal data, health data insights in the context of their DNA. And so yeah, I mean, that's pretty exciting in terms of, the future of healthcare. You think back to where you were with Pathway, what different decisions might you have made then, knowing that this was going to be the reality? Or would you just keep going on the same? And this could be from a product development, from a policy side, because that company's still operational, isn't it?
It is. I think they've changed their model a little bit. They've been working on some AI work and things like that. So I don't know that they're doing consumer genomics anymore, but the company is still in business. But I don't think they're offering consumer genetic testing any longer.
Got it.
Yeah, I think in terms of what we might have done differently at Pathway, I think we certainly would have gone in maybe a little more prepared for the response to the partnership with retail, because it caught us a little bit off guard. We were actually quite surprised by that, both reaction of the industry and sort of thought leaders within the industry, as well as the regulatory and congressional response. And if we'd have known it would have triggered that, maybe we would have done it differently. But I think somebody was going to do that, and it was going to have to be done anyway, right? I mean, you have to push those boundaries to get past sort of the academic discussion of, well, should a consumer have access to their own DNA in a pharmacy or retail, or be able to take this information to their doctor, to what happens when we actually do it? So from a business decision, we might have done things a little bit differently, but I think it was an important step in progressing the field and saying, hey, this isn't causing, calamitous outcomes, and people are having access to this information, whether they initiate it through an online provider or in a retail environment or through a research program like All of Us. Empowering humans to understand and manage their own health is generally, you have to have thoughtful boundaries around it and make sure the information's presented at a proper level for the audience. But it's generally, I think, a net gain in terms of overall health outcomes and individual autonomy. And I think I remember one of the conferences we presented at, a former leader at the FDA came on and said, we have a long history of this, of protecting consumers from that information and sort of protecting or preserving the somewhat patriarchal nature of healthcare, and that only a physician can be trusted to share this information with you, going back to men and women not being included in their own birthing decisions or cancer care, right? And that they can't be trusted to handle this information, and the doctors will protect them as they manage them through those processes. And I think now, if you look at cancer care, patients are very involved in understanding what's happening, the therapies that are happening, even their own roles in helping to provide the therapeutic response. So I think it's the nature of healthcare to be protective, and I think there are good reasons for that, right? We're not sharing photos where if you get it wrong, the implications are generally fairly benign, but sometimes it can be a little bit overprotective and a little too resistant to change and innovation. And I think that's the boundary that I'm glad we passed the Pathway, even if it was certainly create some hardship for the business. But
yeah, well, so interestingly, when you think about Pathway Genomics previously, so that was probably like close to a decade ago when you were with. Yeah. And so what was the, kind of customer, and what was the customer persona then versus what did you observe in the evolution of the marketplace as you moved from, say, Illumina to Helix? And what trends or forcing mechanisms kind of steered the genomics industry into what it is today in hindsight?
Yeah. I think certainly at Pathway, we believe the TAM was everybody, and everybody should get this. But I think the people that were opening up their wallets and purchasing these services were generally your early adopters, right? The people who were at the time, there were all these new wearable technologies and so on. Those people who were kind of in that community of, how do I optimize my health and understand all my risks and overall manage my health most effectively. And I think those were generally the people that were buying it. But there was this difference group, which is people who are maybe primarily interested in the ancestry question and sort of where did I come from an ancestral perspective, and as a corollary, getting some of that health information. And I think we saw that at Ancestry DNA, we saw it at 23andMe, as well as at Pathway, that was maybe driving the broader consumer adoption in those early days to an audience that may be beyond those sort of, we don't like the term biohackers, but that early audience of groups that were really motivated in measuring and tracking their own individual health. As we look at how it's involved, I think because of population programs like All of Us, like what Helix is doing now in collaboration with health systems, and there are a number of these taking place around the world, typically led by governments, people are getting more and more comfortable with access to their DNA and the information being used in collaboration with their healthcare providers. So I think that's why you see it now as part of All of Us. And I don't think it's not really newsworthy or a reason to get, super concerned if people have direct access to their DNA information the way it was a decade ago. So I think we'll increasingly see it used either for people self-managing their own healthcare, or maybe even more impactfully over time is it getting integrated into the electronic health record so that physicians can start to use that information in guiding patients.
Right. That's interesting. So it sounds to me, it's like, well, in the beginning, there was, the early adopters. And then there was, still early adopter, but more kind of mass market feel with respect to the ancestry focus. And I understand the ancestry focus from the perspective of Ancestry.com, because at Ancestry.com, they had this existing business. They had a subscription model where, people were paying a membership monthly to be a part of the community, to access, well, all kinds of records, immigration, health, death certificates, et cetera. And basically people would be building their family tree. And the way it was explained to me is, people would get to the essence of, say, the branches, but having the DNA sequence just took the resolution even deeper. So you could really fill out the leaves. And so you got this really, intimate idea of who you are related to in the community, assuming, of course, there was a significant number of people being sequenced, which there was. I believe there's at least 10 million people have been sequenced. I don't know more. I don't know if those numbers are public, but then I think about 23andMe, and 23andMe, I think they, like you say, they started similarly to Pathway, where they were selling their kits initially for like $799 or even $999. And it was really people who, hey, I want to be proactive. It was, at the time, Ann's wife, co-founder of Google, learns my predisposition to Parkinson's disease. And, here's all the things that I'm going to do to circumnavigate that. Here's a research community we're going to build around it. And then, 23andMe, was really kind of on that consumer genomics health play. And then they took it on the chin also from the FDA. And then they really pivoted into the ancestry, right? And the whole campaign became about, well, finding long lost relatives, which was interesting. But any idea where 23andMe is now in terms of?
I don't want to speak for them, so I wouldn't label myself as an expert on exactly what the business model is. But I think what's interesting to note is for both them and Ancestry DNA is that to be successful in consumer genomics, it really had to be powering a separate business model, right? Because you really do. The consumers are not going to self-pay $799. Those prices are prohibitive for all but the affluent early adopter crown.
Right.
So you do have to get sort of into that sub-$100 price point. And that was the same information that Pathway was given when we were working the partnership with Walgreens. Like, people don't buy these types of things if it's over $100. So you're powering a different business model, right? For Ancestry, it's customer acquisition for their ancestry products, and for 23andMe, it's building a database of patients who may be driven initially by an interest in the ancestry, but they're also consenting and willing to share their data for scientific research, and that information, because the size of their database and the number of people who've participated in that offering is of interest, particularly when they add to it. It's mostly health survey information as opposed to health record information, but you start to gather that large genotypic and phenotypic data set that can be of interest to a number of providers in the healthcare space, whether it's pharma and life sciences companies, or, I think even, payers or sort of health outcome groups would also be really interested in the types of information that can be gleaned when you collect that data.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I understood that their business is on like two tracks right now. Like maybe there might be like a more wellness consumer focused aspect of the product, and then a more explicit research element in terms of, say, subject recruitment, which, by the way, is not so different than what the NIH funded initiative is insofar as All of Us.
That's right.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's right. And I think those are where I think the entire industry evolved, is I think those were maybe somewhat the intents or aspirations of the early consumer genomics companies. And I think all of them have evolved to be much more transparent about that being the intent. I don't know if they were intentionally hiding it, but I think the importance of being really clear that we will use this data for these purposes. I think the industry's evolved quite a bit in that respect over the past decade or so to make sure it's not hidden deep in the terms and conditions somewhere how this data will be used, but to be more and more transparent about the intended use of the data.
Right. It is interesting, right? The I guess consumer perception versus citizen perception, let's say. So, you get on the side of, say, 23andMe doing research, and I'm just philosophizing here without any, let's say, tangible insights around like the contractual nature of these businesses. So yeah, just philosophizing. The consumer's perspective, by the way, it might be, to the capitalist, let's say, profit-focused organization. It's like, oh, I don't know how I feel. I don't feel good about, somebody making a profit off of me. Or maybe I didn't read this, or maybe the terms and conditions were so embedded I didn't actually know what I signed up for. And then there's like over the top concerns like, well, is somebody going to clone me with my DNA? So like there's all, those opportunities for education. So that's just say like a perspective on the, commercial/capitalist side. Then on the state side, you have this kind of Orwellian, type of concern, paranoia around, well, what's the state doing with my DNA? Right. I mean, that was the thing that some of these different organizations ran into, is like having their databases subpoenaed to, basically compare to, let's say, DNA of a crime scene. And so then you find out, that your brother committed a crime kind of thing. And, you've helped the police capture them, but you didn't consent to do that. So there's all these data signatures in our DNA. And I think that's where I was going, although I didn't know it when I first started. The data signatures are not limited to our DNA. So for example, I think about somebody like Elon Musk, right? And I think about, okay, so he owns Twitter, which is basically what everybody's saying all the time ever. He's building a satellite. He has, a global satellite system.
Yep.
And then, now he's got his own, AI, like Grok 1.5, I think is what. And so it's just an interesting time. It's kind of a time where it's hard not to be paranoid with, the invention of AI and the, how that actually interfaces with our biology. And maybe that's a good jumping off point, in your, conversations, your mindset around product innovation, given the climate of AI, global information systems, and then DNA. Is there anything that's got you particularly excited about the future? Thinking about where you started decades ago and oh my gosh, like here we are on the precipice of I don't know what. So what is what? Yeah.
And it's simultaneously excitement and fear, because all these things that can be used for amazing progress can be used for harm. And finding that balance is, a constant challenge with every novel technology. But, when we started this when I was at Pathway a decade ago, we were still kind of finishing or sort of in the midst of digitizing health records, right? So a lot of health records wasn't even digital. So it's hard to analyze, patient outcomes when it's, written in a doctor's notes in a hard to read handwriting in a folder in an office somewhere. But if you can, now that we've digitized most of that data and are on a go forward basis, digitizing all of that data, and then with wearables and sensors and things like that, also able to digitize, environmental factors that can also affect quality of health, you can really start to see, when you put AI engines on top of that and be able to analyze that and make connections and correlations between risk factors and health outcomes that would be almost impossible for a human mind to make those connections to come about, right? So I don't know what those findings will be, but it's not hard to envision a future where we can see what are all these things doing to cause outcomes, either positive or negative in human health and environmental health. So I think that part is super exciting.
Mm-hmm.
But you touched on the flip side of that, which is, malicious players can use that same information in bad ways. I remember when I was at Illumina in a global role, helping governments think about running their own population genomics programs. And sometimes those discussions would lead to, well, should we do the sequencing? Should we send samples outside of their country to the US or somewhere else to do the sequencing? And they'd be concerned about, well, would a military have access to this information and being able to target weapons that are uniquely suited to attack soldiers in a certain environment, right? And being able to create bioweapons that are that targeted based on the DNA and vulnerabilities of a certain population. And I think, COVID sort of feeds some of those fears, right? I don't think that's at all what happened, but you can see how you can, in a somewhat conspiratorial way, start connecting dots, say, that doesn't seem impossible either. So I don't know that I wish I had the answer for you of like, how do we balance all those great possibilities for improvements in human health while mitigating those fears? It's a tough one. And I think it's just something we're going to have to muddle our way along, unfortunately, and sort of figure it out, because I don't think there's an obvious answer And I think certainly with the current state of politics in the U.S., it's hard to imagine that we're going to find a common ground on that in the near term.
Yeah. Well, it's like all these things aren't without risk. I think back to the days of, well, the first human genome being sequenced in 2001, I think it was when it published. There was there was the government-funded initiative that was published in Nature, and then there was the science initiative that was spearheaded by Craig Venter. And then I think about some of the work that Craig Venter did after the human genome. So one of those was like the metagenomic sequencing of the Sargasso Sea. So like grabbing those ocean samples and basically making a case for bringing metagenomics, which is basically sequencing the uncultivatable microbes, because it's actually referred to as, you probably know this, that the 99% majority. So the argument is that 1% of microbes living in marine or soil or whatever, they may be able to subsist or maybe even thrive in a petri dish, but all the other ones are lacking. Actually, this would include your human microbiome as well. They would be it's really hard to cultivate because of all the synergistic reactions and crosstalk that's going on between those microbial communities. So, the idea is to basically collect a bunch of water, filter it through these 2-micron filters, so you have all the bacterial cells on the filter, and then you just extract the DNA from that, and then you basically clone all those DNA fragments into a bacterial clone library, then you sequence it. But the thing is, when you make those clone libraries, you're essentially making you're basically taking things that might not have been able to grow in the lab before, you're putting them in libraries, and now you're growing them. And so who knows, what super genes are in there. And so, and I think it's kind of the way science goes forward in general. Like I think about, oh gosh, I remember, one of my lab supervisors telling me about, back in the day when they would run these DNA gels, you would soak the agarose gel, which is what you would run the DNA on, in this carcinogenic stain called lithium bromide, which it's carcinogenic, that intercalates your DNA, at least DNA mutations. But, these are really smart scientists at Oxford University putting their bare hands into this carcinogen. So, yeah, I think there is that, kind of, we don't know what we don't know sometimes. Right. And so, what are the potential positive and negative synergies on the horizon? Which, I think you're right. We're hearing a lot of this, as it is right now, like the flavor of the day is with AI. Like, not everybody should have access to AI. That's because, reasons that we've just described. And, arguably it's like, well, not everybody should have access to cloning capabilities, but undergraduate students can go out and do the same experiments because these kits exist. And so there's, this great amount of responsibility associated with all these technologies. But okay, enough of the conspiracy. The forests were good. You mentioned Illumina a few times. You had a stint there, and I would say that's a nice kind of segue into Helix. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, who is Illumina? Like, why are they kind of central, or at least historically central, to where we are now with genomics and big data? And then maybe we could finish more towards what's Helix doing in terms of its health systems, and how does that how's that work that you did really setting us up for a fruitful future where everybody has access to their DNA from health solutions.
Yeah. So Illumina is a manufacturer of DNA sequencing instrumentation and the consumables and reagents that go through those instruments to generate genomic data. And they're by far the largest market share provider of this. I think when I was there, we used to estimate that 80 to 90% of the world's DNA was coming off of Illumina instrumentation. I don't know if that statistic still holds true, but so they were certainly, as you mentioned, historically the dominant provider in of the instrumentation that generates genomic data and kicks out the A's and C's and G's and T's of an individual genomic sequence. So their role in my job there was, helping to go, in my case, go around the globe and talking to governments to encourage them to stand up a program to look at the DNA of their population and understand how does this affect, generate the data to drive research of the associations between genetic variation and health outcomes or other variables that affect, societal interests within their population, and not just take data being generated in Western Europe or in the United States to drive these kind of insights. But their role really generally starts and stops there. They would often sort of push in a little bit into that last mile of doing interpretation of genomic data and giving the information down either into a research or diagnostic setting. But that's really, I think, the key distinction between where Illumina generally stops and where Helix is working. So Helix is a big customer of Illumina's. They have consistently have been one of the largest sequencing sites and one of the largest consumers of Illumina's components in running their laboratory in San Diego. But what they're doing today, they started out as a consumer genomics company interpreting that information for in a DNA store for consumers, and now it's evolved to doing that in collaboration with health systems and interpreting, giving that information back to providers and the patients to enroll in these programs. So when a health system signs up with Illumina or with Helix, they're committing to enrolling 100,000 people in their community. Every one of them has their genomic information sequenced using the Helix Exome Plus assay and gets interpreted initially for CDC Tier 1 conditions, which is familial hypercholesterolemia. That's a really hard word to say still after all these years. So we'll call that FH, which is a genetically driven predisposition to having high cholesterol. So you may have, be eating well, exercising, doing all the things that should prevent that, but for genetic reasons, you're developing high cholesterol and can often be surprised when you have a non-expected heart incident at a young age because of that, as well as looking at Lynch syndrome, which is a form of prostate cancer, and hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. And that information gets tested and screened and results given back to the health system for every participant. And Helix finds about 1 in 70 people have pathogenic markers that they may be completely unaware of that can help inform an intervention to prevent those diseases from coming, whether that's getting a statin, increasing the rate of screening, or in some cases, based on a consultation with genetic counselors, clinicians, even something as extreme as a prophylactic mastectomy, particularly if they have a long family history. And that's information that has historically been very difficult to access as a consumer, and let alone engage your health system to say, hey, I'd like to take these actions based on this genetic report that I got off the internet. You run into a lot of resistance.
Right.
It was also training the health systems to support those patients. And when these results come back, have an established care pathway that often begins with a genetic counselor to explain the results that found, what they mean and what they don't mean, and get them routed to a primary care or specialist who can provide them with proper consultation and understands the information so that it be handled responsibly and hopefully prevent illness down the line with proper care. So those are pretty, I think, groundbreaking programs of taking either what maybe the same information was being generated, but in a research context and not being driven to actual patient engagement and changes in their course of and standard of care, and bringing them into practice. So we're actually helping patients. And that's a big change from, where some of these programs have been historically, even if the data already existed. And then subsequently, Helix integrates with the electronic health record so that information can then be subsequently queried for additional diagnostic tests that can be done in digital time. So you don't have to collect new samples, submit it to the lab, wait a few weeks for that information to get generated, interpreted, and sent back, schedule a follow-up appointment with the doctor. But during that same appointment in which the information is requested, the doctor might be able to get that result back and help that inform the patient's patient journey from that point forward.
Got it. So that's on the sequence one's query often model.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. And yeah, again, just for the layperson, it's like if you consider all those example tests that you just talked about, like if you were suspected of, hyperfamilial cholesterolemia or breast cancer or prostate cancer or any number of other, symptom related issues that you would want a diagnostic to follow up on, you would need to order a DNA panel every time to get that test. And then those tests each time, depending on the test and depending on physician sign off anyway, they can be thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah. And often depending on your family history and other factors may or may not be covered by insurance.
Right. Okay. And so the alternative we're talking about today is like I think it's around between $300 and $400 now. You can get your full genome sequenced and then have that subject to, the analysis of the physician going forward. Is that like the change?
Yeah. And it's actually, so enrollment in these programs is free for the consumer. So they don't pay anything to get the initial enrollment done. And in most cases, these tests, if the patient meets the criteria for testing, they should be covered by insurance. So the consumer cost to participate in this is dramatically lower than maybe in similar programs historically. Yeah. And I think that's a role that both Helix and Illumina have played. It's just driving down the cost of of sequencing and interpretation by introducing other technologies that drive the efficiency. So Illumina has a famous chart comparing the drop in the cost of sequencing to Moore's law, which famously lowered the cost of computer chips steadily, and how much faster it's dropped the price from when I joined Illumina. It was getting down to $1,000 genome in terms of just getting the sequencing done. I'm not even sure what the current price is. I feel like it's around $400 or $500.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing when you consider the first human genome project was, I don't know, in billions. So yeah. So just maybe I'll make sure I summarize this to see if I understood what you're saying in terms of Illumina and Helix. So like Illumina is the wet lab and the consumables, and Helix seems to be like the analytics, the dry lab, the bioinformatics pipeline, the digital dive.
Right. Helix is also a wet lab. So Helix runs the laboratory using Illumina equipment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. But Helix has built the bioinformatic capabilities on top of the software on top of the wet lab hardware that manufactures. Okay.
That's correct.
So now in terms of let's just say a future for genomics, in terms of this is the thing that I struggled with, particularly in my previous venture, Athletigen, which was focused on human performance, is okay, you've got all this great information, but how are we actioning it, right? So what I'm referring to here is, I could look at DNA and I can see, like, this just used like the best characterized and most statistically supported markers are those associated with injury predisposition. Now there's some other interesting ones too in terms of training response genes physiologically that might be interesting in terms of, and sorry, I should reframe this to think about Olympians, let's say. So at the tip of the spear. And, so you're looking at training response, and, maybe that informs your training strategy. So you go at minimum effective dose because you only have a certain amount of time to allocate to training. And then the third area was more of like a nutrigenomics. So learning more about your specific food sensitivities, predispositions to be deficient in different nutrients. Those things, obviously, they burn out or they show up, in much subtler ways, but not so subtle. It's really the difference of making a final or winning the world championship. Is like, it really is the tip of the spear. But, you got all this great information in theory, but then in practice, it's, how do you implement it? And so, what I would find is there were always those just super curious coaches who would just like push the boundary, and sometimes athletes, do it yourself. So are we seeing that in the early stages of people that do these programs, like all of us or the different health systems? Like, do we see people like exporting their data, bringing it proactively to their physicians? It seems to me that if they are, that is a little disjointed. How do we get to the point of full integration into your health record, which I think is what you've described, but I don't think we're at the point where it's just DNA plus health record plus AI yet.
No, we're not. I mean, we made a lot of progress there, but it's not that straightforward. And Helix is not putting, and nobody's putting a whole genome into an EHR and asking the physician to sort of, or the patient to do their own research against it.
Right.
So I think they're still very much focused on what are the established diagnostic capabilities to say, hey, this is, you do have a pathogenic marker on your BRCA gene or whatever it might be, or you do have a pharmacogenomic indicator, which is going to affect your response to a given therapy. So it is still kind of a little bit, certainly at least focused on the more traditional model of healthcare of, I have something wrong and I'm having an intervention, and how do I improve the efficacy of that as opposed to prevention?
Right.
So I think that's still where we are, except for those consumers who are taking it on their own to download and analyze that data themselves. And I think that's maybe more a function of just the way our health system operates more so than capability, but it's still a pretty reactive healthcare system.
Yeah. And sorry, I wasn't sure if I heard you properly when you talked about, some of the value that the health systems that Helix is already delivering, whereas was it 1 in 70 or 1 in 7 people have a pathogenic marker that they may not have known?
1 in 70, 1 in 70.
1 in 770. Okay. So yeah.
And that's from an all-comers population. So that's people, anybody is welcome to participate. The only requirement is to be an adult. So it's 18 and over.
Okay.
So it's not picking people who have, some family history that might they perceive to put them at higher risk, or some phenotypic indication that would be an inclusion criteria. It's an all-comers population.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And I mean, that number is going to change presumably as we start to know more and more about the different, let's say.
Absolutely. And I mean, already today in pharmacogenomics, which is looking at how this information can be used to inform therapeutic selection or implementation, I think some studies have shown that around 90% of people have a marker that could influence the selection or application of a therapeutic. So that only comes into place when the patient needs that therapy, right? So knowing that you might have a adverse response to Plavix or whatever it might be doesn't matter until you need to go on Plavix. But I think that's where almost everybody has some marker that would indicate, even using current knowledge, something that could inform the selection of that therapy.
Mm-hmm. What about you personally? Have you benefited anyway in knowing your DNA that you can speak of, that you want to share?
I can't think of anything that changed directly, although I think it's a little bit of the removal of the unknowns.
Right.
So my mother died of breast cancer when I was very young. I was 11 years old. My mom passed, and I was a kid. Genetics weren't a factor there. So I don't think we have any insight as to whether it was genetic or not, other than maybe some assumptions based on her biological family not having a high rate of breast cancer, suggesting maybe it wasn't genetic. So I remember this was actually a test that I got at Pathway, which is probably in early days of this. So it was probably not the most comprehensive test, but it was the first time I had to sort of face that fact of like, wow, I might have some markers that predispose me, which is a male I wasn't super concerned about. But I also at the time had I believe 12-year-old daughter, and had to sit there before I opened those results and say, I actually have to be like, am I going to just, if I come back with a positive result that might affect me, but maybe more importantly or more likely to affect my daughter, how do we have that conversation, and when do we have it, and how does that happen, and what's the appropriate thing? So that was, I think, the most insightful or sort of personal experience for me from genomics is when and how do you have that conversation with a sibling or an offspring who's potentially affected, and what's the right time to tell somebody that they might have these life-altering information. And I think that's one of the most important things to think about with this, which is how making sure, and this is where genetic counseling can play a key role, is helping to educate people that you're not just learning the information for yourself, but you're potentially learning it for your siblings and your children, and making sure that that's a positive experience and not a negative one.
That's a really important perspective, and thank you for sharing that. But it was actually what kind of triggered my focus into genomics also is my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis at a young age, 14. And, she came home and we had to have that conversation. And that was one of the things she said is like, I don't know if it's genetic, right? It's part environmental, it's part genetic, it's both. How does it work? And so, yeah, I mean, those are certainly things that, I look at my own pathogenic markers, and there are, depending on the kind of confidence level constraints you assign to the variables in the ClinVar database, for example. I mean, I can see an overrepresentation of, potentially harmful variants, and then I can see, a more conservative view. And yeah, those insights do lead to conversations with my wife, with our daughter when she's old enough to understand. But the interesting thing there actually makes me think of, the next issue around, well, I think we're protected. I think you are definitely in the US in terms of health insurance, but life insurance is a different thing, right?
Yep.
Of like, once you have this information, do you have to now disclose it? And then, okay, well, if you do, does that affect your premiums? And then if that's all true, are people averse to getting that information at all? And, I keep coming back to this statement that, one of my previous interviewees, Dr. Brandon Colby, made, who's founder, CEO of sequencing.com, medical geneticist. We talk about this very same problem. And he says, look, as a physician, it's well known, like as an expert physicians generally would say that denial is the biggest killer. So like genetics out of the scenario is you get a diagnosis and you choose to ignore it when there is potentially life-saving interventions. Well, that's a serious contributor. That's the leading, cause to negative health outcomes. And so, but then you have this battle of like, well, there may be the I don't want to know it all, and that's your choice. But the I don't want to know because I might not get life insurance I mean, that's a tough one, right? Because it's like, well, now if I do know, maybe I can do something to add 10 or 20 years to my life. Um, so like, what do we do about that? Ed, give us the answer.
Well, actually, this is one of my most interesting areas. I actually spent a lot of time at Illumina talking with a number of leading health insurance or life insurance companies wrestling with this same question. So I can share a little bit, I think, to represent their perspective as well.
Yeah.
First, I would say this is maybe a personal view. I think life insurance is more of a financial vehicle, whereas health insurance I view as a little bit more of a right or something that we should aspire to give everybody access to, right?
That's an important distinction. Sure. Yeah.
So I think it's much more important that people have access to health care than it is that they have access to a life insurance policy. Doesn't mean it's not an important question, but I do think it's an important distinction that these are different types of insurance for different objectives. The life insurance industry operates a little bit on uncertainty, right? You don't know if you buy life insurance because you don't know if you're going to have cancer or hit by a bus, any of those things. And you're basically placing a bet or a protection against some of those things that have an unlikely chance of happening, but not zero. And you want some protection for your family in the event that those happen. Their fear actually was if everybody knows, at a time when they would make the decision to purchase life insurance, they'd remove a lot of those unknowns, right? I've looked at my DNA. I don't have any of the pathogenic markers that make me predisposed to cancer. We don't know everything, but boy, that risk seems a lot lower. And then you add in, cars are getting smarter. The chances of with all the sensors and things like that, and safety technologies in cars. I don't know if I need, my chance of getting hit by a bus or being in a fatal car accident seem pretty low. I'm just going to opt not to buy insurance, and I'll take what would be an insurance premium. I'll put into an investment account for my kid. That seems like a safer bet. So they're really afraid of this for similar reasons. Of if you know what you're going to do, people will stop buying life insurance because the element of the unknown diminishes.
Yeah.
And they just concluded, I would say, and this is a broad stroke for a large industry, but there was actually do more harm for them to try and capture this information and make it part of the underwriting process, because it would one, the trust question is a very significant one, but also it removes those things that that contribute to people buying life insurance in the first place. And then they would also say, they kind of do this anyway, right? You're not going to get at least a large life insurance policy today without answering a family health questionnaire. And you're going to answer that, your mom had multiple sclerosis, and I'm going to answer that my mom had breast cancer. And if you answer those questions incorrectly, your policy might get denied. Or if you need to make a claim against a policy, that will get denied. So they're kind of doing it already today. They don't want to necessarily get expert at it because that removes all the uncertainty that contributes to people buying that, because they're trying to protect against that uncertainty. So they ultimately, I think, concluded that it's certainly an area that they're interested in following, but they're not going to move aggressively in that direction. However, where I do think, and I don't know this is actually materialized, after you have a policy in place, right? So you've already got your policy, you're already protected for life insurance. Now they're perfectly aligned with you. They want you to live as long and healthy as possible so you don't claim that life insurance policy.
Right.
So now maybe they should be the ones paying for you to get screened for those CDC tier 1 conditions so that you can intervene against an early heart attack or early cancer. Right. The health insurance industry is kind of doing that, but it's a screening. It's still generally not covered. But a life insurance company has a different set of incentives that are, once you have a policy, is very much aligned with you.
Right. So they want you to live as long as possible and never claim. Right.
Yeah.
And they don't want to develop a reputation for not honoring claims, because that's bad for business also. Yeah. That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective I hadn't quite thought through. And then, the other thing that you mentioned is, okay, well, this is really a financial decision. And so let's say, we're every year de-risking certain causes of death, let's say. So if you're young, maybe and you have a young family and you're not financially established, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's good to have this policy and buy young, by the way, because it's cheaper. But then maybe, in parallel, because you're investing in the health insurance as more kind of a reactive, emergency parachute for your significant other, let's say, and your families, should the unthinkable happen. But then at the same time, you're, as you say, you're investing into the long term, for your family. And then, so the goal is to really build your own, life insurance policy, because, a lot of these policies, they're like $1 million, $2 million. And it's like, well, if you buy the right, investment portfolio when you are 30, 25, maybe even, it's amazing how just some modest savings, take a page out of Warren Buffett's book, some modest contributions every year, how that can actually turn into something. So it's a really, I think, important conversation, because I think a lot of people listening, let's face it, most people don't have access to their DNA. And, for some of them, the hesitation is around, what we just discussed. Obviously I'm sequenced, you're sequenced. I'm not peer pressure here to anybody listening, but you do see, these government programs that are, making, health screening, or DNA sequencing as ubiquitous as your basic, infant screens, whether that be, hearing, heel prick, ear test, hearing test, heel prick, bilirubin counts, for example. Like, this becomes a standard part of the question, especially, I think about that, as a new parent, knowing, like you say, the reassurance, and not, it's not 100%, but just, that we don't have to worry about some, inborn error of metabolism that, if left unchecked, could lead to compromised development. Like PKU is a well-established one, but there are other, infant or early childhood specific rare diseases that, is part of the, some of these programs where they're looking specifically at, infant screening. So, So anyway, really fascinating conversation. What I'm thinking now is, in terms of the, the call it legacy and future work. So think about where you've been, let's say the last few decades, and the contributions you've made. I won't hold you to this, but what I'm interested in is, your legacy and future work. So looking forward into, let's say, what are we now? We're 2024. Where are we in, 2050? And what kind of hope and, legacy and contribution do you think you would feel good about making to, genomics? And then, maybe leave us on a high note. Like, what excites you the most about the future of genomics and personalized healthcare?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple small questions to wrap up with.
If Ed, yeah.
Well, I think, starting with Pathway and then continuing, particularly at Helix, I think where I've enjoyed is taking all this, amazing research and all this amazing stuff that's happening in research labs and academics, and pushing it through that last mile. Like, how do we get this information to consumers? Because it's an interesting publication, but it's not really helping anybody until it gets into people's hands, right? So I think that, to me, is the key piece that I'd like to continue focusing my career on, whether that's continue to work with a genomics company that's doing specifically genomic information, how that can inform healthcare decisions, or somebody that's taking genomic data and other data, and how do we get that into information that can form a broader set of questions, kind of what you were alluding to, and ultimately in human performance, and not just response to diseases or that might affect an individual. Helping to fix that last minute where this information becomes actionable, as opposed to just interesting from an academic perspective. And I think that's, we've made a lot of progress in the last decade or so. I think, Pathway's role in sort of turning over the apple cart a little bit in terms of consumer genomics, and helping to be one part of paving the way that that's an okay thing. And that's, there's a lot of benefit that comes from people accessing this information in traditional ways. And I think that probably in a little bit also helped contribute to the expansion of telehealth during the pandemic, and saying, hey, we need people to get access to these tests or this information, and we just don't have the ability to do it all in person. So these things that have been slightly proven out in different scenarios, it becomes more and more possible. And I think the expansion of access to care through different modalities is maybe a long tail byproduct of some of those early models that we were testing at Pathway with consumer genomics. And I think we'll continue to see consumers have more of a role in their healthcare across different modalities and different disease area and therapeutic areas. So that's exciting. And I think, for me, if I can continue to, it's my next chapter, figure out the right place to help play a role in that, and helping to sort of work through that labyrinth of the healthcare system, where you have to address, payer considerations, legal considerations, regulatory considerations, operational and just tactical considerations. It's a lot to find something successful that can successfully reach the hand of a patient and their provider to inform a better health outcome. So that's kind of my personal goal. I think we talked a little bit earlier about are these technologies exciting or dangerous? And I think that the truth is that they're both, right? That's a common expression that any technology can be good or bad. It's all in how it's applied. I do have a fundamental faith in humanity and that most people do want to do the right thing, and that we are inherently a little bit cautious about some of these things, and we don't just jump in and start, editing people's DNA recklessly or running scientific experiments without any controls. And I think a lot of systems, whether it's around insurance protections and privacy, or just the roles of IRBs and things like that, all help to contribute to that. Sometimes that means it moves a little bit more slowly than some of us would like, and we're often, I think, proven right that we're maybe being overly cautious. But you have to protect against those worst case scenarios, and I think that's a positive, that we have to continue to recognize the role of that, even if it slows down the things that look and prove out to be good, well intentioned for the benefit of individuals, and have to go through these processes. But I think if you sort of look forward another 25 years or so, like I said, to 2050. The explosion of all this data being digital, tools being able to analyze it and make sense of it, and the results of that, I think the biggest challenge isn't going to be the generating of those insights. It's going to be, how do we create, what are the policies and systems at a societal level to help make that information useful and actionable? And I think those things can also be a little bit of a sausage factory, but ultimately we find our way to find those things, right? So, sort of bringing it back to life insurance, and maybe that, when we have all information about why people are going the greatest risk factors, life insurance dies as an industry, and it gets replaced with a social safety net that everybody's automatically participating in through more of a government run program or something like that, where there's a different form of insurance that is less about a mortality event and more about addressing other things, and might be a free market solution that comes up with a different business model that protects against those uncertainties that continue to persist. So I remain an optimist. I think we find our way to muddle through those things. We spend a lot of time, and I think a lot of the industry is full of a lot of well-intentioned, thoughtful people who think about the negative consequences, and by and large prevent them from coming to fruition, while ultimately moving to the industry in a way that's toward the benefit of individuals and their overall health or other outcomes.
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to create a soundbite from that is real-time data that's actionable, that can save your life, has the whole world marching as one towards the preservation of human life, and potentially no longer any need for life insurance because we've got a community support network that maximizes life. Wow.
I like it. It's well summarized.
Big vision. Yeah, I just that prompt into Chat GPT, and I came back out with that. Great prompt. Okay, so Ed, I can't thank you enough for joining. In terms of listeners wanting to get in touch with you, to learn more about your projects, your next big moves in your career, or to just check in on the field of genomics in general, is it LinkedIn that's the best way to reach out? Or are you on Twitter? Or what are your handles? How do we connect people with you?
Yeah, I have accounts on most of those social media platforms, but I'm not very active on them. So I would say LinkedIn is the one that you're most likely to be able to reach me, and maybe I'll try and be a little more prolific on those things. But
sure, yeah. Well, okay, so yeah, it'd be Edgar McBean on LinkedIn. I'll put that in the show notes so people can find you. Again, Ed, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I've enjoyed it. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us this week on another enlightening journey through the world of genomics, this time led by Conversations with Edgar McBean. Hope you found the conversation as inspiring and informative as I did. Edgar's insights into the evolution of genomics and its potential to revolutionize healthcare offers but a glimpse into a future where personalized medicine will become the norm. Today, we learn how the integration of genomic data with healthcare systems could lead to better health outcomes, the importance of consumer access to their own DNA, and the ethical complexities of managing this powerful information. Edgar's dedication to making genomic insights actionable and accessible to all is a testament to the positive impact that science can have on our lives. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, family, and anyone interested in the future of healthcare. Today, we can spread the love and knowledge that genomics brings to our understanding of health and wellness. Now, until next time, stay curious and keep exploring incredible potential within your DNA.